2006, whose families still didn't know where they were. You know, quite a really shameful situation. But I went through the available documents that were made publicly available by the Pentagon, which was unclassified summaries of the alleged evidence about who they were and what they were supposed to have done, which was incredibly thin in so many cases. And I, you know, compiled basically a chronology and worked out who all the men were, and that was published as a book, the Guantanamo Files, in 2007. And you know, I've carried on working on Guantanamo ever since. I co-directed a film about Guantanamo called Outside the Law in 2009. I set up the Closed Guantanamo campaign with my American lawyer friend Tom Wilner, who argued the Guantanamo prisoners' cases in their Supreme Court cases seeking habeas corpus rights. So Tom was very involved in those court cases from 2004 to 2008. And, you know, and what a long and sad journey it's been that we've ended up still with the prison open. You know, we, I'm sure all remember that we had 8 years of President Obama promising to close the prison within a year of taking office, and leaving after 8 years without having closed it. Now, to his credit, he did release nearly 200 men. He faced unparalleled and unprincipled opposition from Republicans during his tenure, but he didn't take the final step as commander-in-chief and go out of his comfort zone and close the prison. So, you know, we all then, I'm sure, remember that he handed over a prison that still contained 41 men to the monstrous Donald Trump. And even before he took office, Donald Trump tweeted, that seemed to be his way of governing. He tweeted 2 weeks before he was inaugurated, "There must be no more releases from Gitmo." And during his 4 years, he only released one man. That was a man who had agreed to a plea deal several years before, which in exchange for him testifying against some of the high value detainees, meant that he would be sent back to Saudi Arabia for continued imprisonment. So that was the only release that took place during his 4 years. I can't imagine how awful that was for men who by that point had been held for 15 years at Guantanamo, to just live through this 4 years when nothing happened, when the place was essentially sealed shut by Donald Trump. No one got in, despite his claims that he wanted to fill it up with bad guys. That was a very stupid thing to say. And even when he was surrounded by the most deranged people, there were people around him with enough knowledge to know that Guantanamo was a failed experiment that should never be replicated. If you want to prosecute people, do it in the courts on the US mainland. The only reason for sending anyone to Guantanamo would be so that you can torture and abuse them, and then end up being able to do anything legally with them. And you know, and I think we can say that the United States has realized that that was not a good idea. The problem is closing it is still fraught with problems, really because of the extra legal manner in which Guantanamo was set up in the first place, and the legacy, the poisonous legacy of how the Republicans politicized it so abominably during Obama's presidency. So President Biden inherited 40 men just over a year ago. And I'm sad to say that he has only released one man since he took office. He sent a Moroccan who had been approved for release back home to his family last summer. Now, the problem with that is that it's not as though these 40 men that he's holding are all people who have been charged with crimes, in which case he could legitimately sit on his hands and, you know, hope that the military commission process was going to work, even though the military commission trial process at Guantanamo is an abject failure. But only 10 of the men that he's holding, have been charged. 2 others have been through that process. So that's 12. out of the 39 that he's currently holding. So what about the other 27? Well, he inherited a number of prisoners who had been approved for release, some under Obama who hadn't been freed before Obama left office, and one who was approved for release under Donald Trump, right at the end of his presidency. These releases were mainly through the second review process that was established by President Obama. He set up a first review process in his first year in office, whereby officials met every week to review the cases of the prisoners, and decided that that 2/3 of them should be released, and nearly all of those people were released before Obama left office. He then set up a second review process, which is kind of like a parole process, although with one particular distinction, which is that parole hearings normally apply to people who have been sentenced, whereas the people at Guantanamo have never been charged or tried with a crime, apart from the small number who have. So the periodic review boards required people to demonstrate that, basically to demonstrate contrition for what they were accused of, regardless of whether they did what they were accused of or not. They had to appear contrite, and also to be able to put together a coherent plan for their life after Guantanamo, which would reassure the authorities that they weren't going to take up arms against the United States or cause trouble in any other way. It was a way that Obama was able to bypass Republican opposition on the one hand, but it was also because his first review process had suggested that there were many dozens of prisoners that his review board were not happy to see released, but they also recognized that they couldn't charge them. Now, that's obviously a very gray area that none of us should be happy with. If you don't have evidence that you can use against somebody, then you really don't have a case against them. And obviously, Obama knew that this was going to cause real problems in the human rights world, which it did. So the parole type hearings were a way of kind of addressing that. And during the Obama presidency, 38 men were approved for release through the periodic review boards. All but 2 of those were freed. And what we've seen under President Biden is that he has now, his review boards have now approved for release another 14 men since he took office. So that's now 19 of the 39 men still held. Almost half the men still held have been approved for release. And that is progress, you know, very much that's progress in the sense that all of these men were previously, had previously been described accurately in the mainstream media as forever prisoners. You know, they were held indefinitely without charge or trial. And although their cases were reviewed, the periodic review boards review people's cases every 3 years, sometimes more frequently. And they consistently were coming up with these decisions that it was still too dangerous to release these people because they weren't contrite enough, or they didn't appear to be behaving themselves sufficiently, or they couldn't put together a coherent enough plan for what they were going to do after they left Guantanamo. And so, you know, this really is reassuring, but, you know, you will, I'm sure by now, have realized that the non-reassuring bit is that none of them have actually been freed. Now, I know that Joe Biden wants to keep Guantanamo under the radar to avoid, you know, the Republicans cynically making as much fuss as they can about things. But, you know, we don't have any proper reassurances that they're actually working as hard as they should be to get these people released. Some of them can be sent back to their home countries. That shouldn't really be very problematical. For a number of others, primarily Yemenis, and there are 8 Yemenis who are amongst these men, and one Somali as well. They can't be sent back to their home countries. The entire US establishment won't send people back to Yemen because they regard it as too dangerous. And the Congress, the Republican Congress under Obama, when he didn't have control of Congress, passed a law preventing the return of people to Yemen and also to Somalia. So third countries have to be found for these men. And that's, that's not the easiest of things to arrange, because you've got to find countries that are prepared to treat these men humanely. And it requires the appointment of somebody to deal with that within the administration, which Obama did. It was the Office of the Envoy, Special Envoy for Guantanamo closure. That was shut down by Donald Trump. And Joe Biden hasn't revived it. Now, we know that there is somebody or there are people in the State Department that are dealing with these resettlement issues to some extent, but it's not reassuring that the administration doesn't have an actual official appointed specifically to deal with the issues of resettlement in particular, but also I would say for, monitoring what's happened to former prisoners, and also for being the person who is responsible for addressing the administration's response to Guantanamo itself, the need for it to be closed, and what progress is being made on that front. So, I'm very disappointed that we're in this position where the Biden administration is accumulating prisoners who have been approved for release and yet is not actually freeing them. Because how long do you hold somebody that you've approved for release without releasing them before it becomes some kind of terribly bitter joke? And that's really the problem. So, I would say that really, I think that the administration has taken on board the recognition that it cannot keep holding people indefinitely without charge or trial. The fact that so many of these forever prisoners have been approved for release, there are now only 8 forever prisoners left. And reviews are, ongoing in the cases of these men. And I think we can be absolutely certain that some, if not the majority of these men, will also be approved for release over the next 6 months or this year at some point, which will get us to the position that we need to be in, that the only people that are demonstrably being held at Guantanamo are the ones who are facing charges, and that everybody else has been approved for release and must be freed. And I think it's significant as well, if you don't know this, that last year 24 senators and 75 members of the House of Representatives wrote letters to President Biden, not only calling on him to close Guantanamo, but also pointing out that they regarded it as intolerable that the United States was continuing to hold men indefinitely without charge or trial. You could say, well, why did they not think that from the beginning? But to be honest, it's really taken this long for it to have become such a politically toxic issue. And I think the 20th anniversary had something to do with that. When you've been holding people without charge or trial 5 years into the war on terror, people really didn't seem bothered at all. 10 years, maybe some people were starting to pay attention. 20 years, I think it became something where it's basically been too long. I'm rather saddened that it took so long to reach this point. But having reached it, I don't think there's any going back. It is, of course, absolutely scandalous that you would hold somebody for 20 years without charging them with a crime. And without holding the only other option would have been to hold them properly as prisoners of war, and the United States never did that. Otherwise, they would now all be free because the war is over. The war in Afghanistan is over. So that's the situation we're in. I hope that kind of sums up where we're at. I don't know what you want to do now, Sarah, whether people might have questions. I'm certainly, happy to talk more about issues if people have any questions.
Yeah, what I was going to do was I was going to just sort of explain what Lewes Amnesty has been doing, and just what other amnesty groups have been doing throughout the country, and the establishment of the Guantanamo network, and the work that we've been doing on that.
Yes,
but what's that? Sorry. But I can either do my talk, which I was just going to talk for 5 minutes, and then we can have questions about all of it, or we could stop and people could ask Andy questions now. What would people prefer? Or do you want me just to make a decision? Has anybody got any particular questions for Andy right now? Perhaps we can do that, and then I can move on with my part. Yes, Jill?
I hope as a visitor, I'm allowed to ask a question.
Of course.
I was just wondering what whether they've been continue. I mean, obviously the fact that they're still in prison is torture in itself, but what are the conditions that the prisoners are in? Have they improved since they've been sort of left languishing, or are they still as bad as before? What are the conditions that they're in?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that generally conditions improved to some extent when President Obama took over. I'm not really sure. I think basically what's happened with the place is that it still runs in this kind of mad way that prisons tend to do. So it all becomes about the rules and the enforcement of the rules, and it's petty, and it's, underlying it all is still this notion that they're holding these terrible people. But these are aging men, many of whom have got medical issues, who are not causing them problems, and so I think really it's become a kind of pointless warehousing of people for the most part. If prisoners cause them problems, and over the years, of course, they've the main weapon that the prisoners have had that they can use is hunger strikes, and there are still, I believe, a few prisoners on hunger strike, in which case they try and deal with that. But this is the general prison population. So the prisoners regarded as high value detainees, which is somewhere over a dozen of them, are held in a separate facility. Now they were held. These are the guys who came from the CIA black sites in September 2006. So they've been there ever since, and they were put in a special super secret facility called Camp 7, which no one was even supposed to be allowed to know where it was, and certainly no one was allowed to visit it under any circumstances. That prison has been falling apart. They've had problems with basically the building was falling apart. And what they did, I can't quite remember now when it was, either 1 or 2 years ago, they moved all of those high value detainees into one of the other prison blocks, Camp 5. So the lower value detainees are held in Camp 6, and the high value detainees are now held in Camp 5. Both Camps 5 and 6 were modeled on maximum security prison blocks in the United States when they were built. But Camp 5 is basically a prison of isolated cells, whereas Camp 6 has got communal areas. And that was in particular the breakthrough that happened under Obama, I think, was that they started to be allowed to mingle in those communal areas. But as far as I know, the high value detainees are still pretty much isolated, although prisoners in Guantanamo have always worked out over the years ways in which they can communicate with each other, whether it's by shouting or whatever. So yeah, that's the situation. But I think obviously it was extremely difficult because of COVID, because no one was allowed to visit. So the only lifeline that the prisoners have in terms of real human beings is their lawyers visiting them. If you behave well in Guantanamo, you are allowed, you know, a limited amount of calls to your family. So that would be one way that they could stay in touch with the outside world. But it must have been a very isolating time. And I think in general, the atmosphere in the prison must just be very sad, really, you know, because these people are aging and, you know, and because there are so many associated problems that they have. I mean, you know, they're getting ill, and some of that is as a result of the way they've been treated over the years. But some of it's just the very fact that, you know, if you were in your late 30s when they took you to Guantanamo, you're now in your late 50s. If you were, you know, if you were a young man at the age of 20, you're now 40. It's, you know, it's the time scale of it is has just it's just gone on for so long. It's really horrible.
I have a question, Andy. I mean, given that it was the anniversary, and Sarah's going to talk about what we did to commemorate it, and there were articles in the Guardian and so forth. The Guardian did a good job of covering it. Have you heard any? Has there been any response to the anniversary? Has the anniversary made any difference aside from general raising of awareness? Is there any news?
Well, you know,
out of that?
I have to say that, you know, what the mainstream media does is that it takes notice of things when there's something significant and then moves on. So there was a great flurry of mainstream media interest, but you know, on this topic, as in so many that I regard as being of permanent importance, rather than, you know, an event that happens and isn't repeated, but continuing injustices are things that I think the mainstream media just generally covers very poorly, because they focus on it for a moment, then it disappears until something significant happens, and suddenly it's back. In terms of the Biden administration's response, cynically, it was definitely cynical, but not in the most horrible way. What the Biden administration did was make these announcements around the time of the anniversary that 5 of these men who've been approved for release had been approved for release. So before the anniversary, we knew that there were 9 men who'd been approved for release by Biden, and then afterwards we knew that there were 14 because 5 men's release was approved. And you know that you get it. That's a good thing, but it doesn't mean anything until you release them. I will say that there was one piece of particularly bad news that came out at that time, which most people didn't notice, which was that one of the men still held was approved for ongoing imprisonment without charge or trial. Since Biden took office, there have only been 2 men who've been through the periodic review boards who haven't been approved for release. Now, one of those men is Abu Zubaydah, who some of you will know as the unfortunate first victim of the CIA torture program. A man who the CIA falsely alleged, and they should have known better at the time, to be the number 3 in Al-Qaeda when he wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda at all. And he was tortured and held for 4.5 years in CIA black sites before arriving at Guantanamo. Has never been charged with the crime, never will be charged with the crime, I think. They haven't made a decision in his case. His case was reviewed back in May, June, July, can't remember the exact month, and they haven't reached a decision. But the only other case in which a prisoner has had a PRB since Biden became president and had his ongoing imprisonment approved was a man called Khalid Qasim. And that story came out on January the 11th, the actual anniversary. And Khalid was a very good friend of Mansour Adayfi, who some of you will know as Mansour has been very, very busy doing events, following up on the book that he had published last August called Don't Forget Us Here, which I urge anyone with an interest in Guantanamo to read. It is the most astonishing mixture of an incredibly harrowing narrative of what happens when a bunch of, primarily his experience, him and a bunch of other young Yemenis primarily fought hard against the horrible injustice to which they were subjected and were punished horribly in response. And yet Mansour's account is also very funny and is also completely shot through with an extraordinary humanity. So it's really quite an experience. But Khalid was one of Mansour's friends. So Khalid had also resisted the injustice of Guantanamo by fighting against the authorities, by engaging in hunger strikes. He was a cell block leader. So, you know, he was good at standing up for his fellow prisoners, but that gets you marked out as somebody who's troublesome. Khalid is also a really talented artist. As we found out when the prisoners under Obama, there was a brief period when art absolutely flourished in Camp 6, and Khalid's work has been amazing. You know, Mansour also reports, you know, that he's a poet, a writer, a footballer. Khalid really seems this extraordinary character, and yet he finds it hard to behave in a way that he is required to behave when he comes to be reviewed by the Periodic Review Board, and they decided that he wasn't compliant enough, and that they couldn't trust him to be released. Now, this is a man who, there's no case against him for anything he did before he got to Guantanamo. He had simply been a foot soldier assisting the Taliban in their ongoing civil war against the Northern Alliance before 9/11. And then that mutated into becoming a terrorist against the USA after 9/11 and then getting Guantanamo. So it's not about anything that he did before. It's about his behavior in Guantanamo. He can't get out of the prison because he can't behave how they want him to behave. I was told that when he was asked about, you know, what plans he'd made for putting his life back together after Guantanamo, he couldn't really engage with it properly. He basically, you know, he said, well, what prospects do I have? You know, you've taken 20 years of my life from me. So I think it's shameful. I think it highlights the problem with the Periodic Review Board process, in that you can see, again, the parameters for it are not functioning very well, because there is no reason for them to carry on holding Khalid. He has another review in a few months' time. I'm hoping that what happens then is that his lawyers will be able to work with him to kind of guide him through the right behavior that will enable him to join the list of people who've been approved for release, who we hope will eventually be released. But I found that a very sad situation after all this time, that you know, we've moved away from what happened when the prisoners were fighting their cases in the US courts, when they fought a long battle for habeas corpus rights. There was a brief period of a couple of years from 2008 to 2010 when judges were looking at the government's evidence, and in case after case after case were saying to the government, you haven't established that these people had any significant involvement with either Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And what happened after a couple of years, when 36 men were approved for release by the courts, was that the next court up, the appeals court in Washington, D.C., which was stacked full of right-wing judges at the time, just changed the rules on habeas corpus so that the prisoners couldn't win. They basically said, amongst other things, they issued a ruling that said everything the government said had to be treated as presumptively accurate, regardless of how ridiculous it was. And, you can imagine, I'm sure, that it's very difficult to rebut a case when you're held in an isolation cell in Guantanamo with no access to anything to help you try and argue against it. So, that's been the situation at Guantanamo. It's very important to remember, really, that the law has consistently failed to do anything for these men. And that the position that they're in now is that, you know, an administrative decision has been taken with no legal enforcement whatsoever about the supposed dangerousness of Khalid Qasim and why he can't be released. But what underpins all of this, and the problem that we, you know, that probably the most significant thing about Guantanamo now is that all of these men are approved for release, all 19 of them. There is no mechanism whatsoever that exists that can oblige the United States government to release them. No mechanism. There is no legal mechanism behind these decisions that have been taken that can ensure that they are actually freed from the prison. And that's, you know, just one of those sad indictments of how monstrously unjust Guantanamo is, how it remains a place untouched by the law, and how fundamentally, if that's the position that you're in, you can't get out of that place under any circumstances. There's no legal requirement for you to be freed, even though processes are gone through where you're told that you can leave, then you are effectively all political prisoners.